Hi, welcome to week 10 of our Introduction to Education online course. This week we're going to be talking about the history of America's struggle for educational opportunity. So if you'd like to join me in your text as we look at our objectives for this week, and then we will get into the PowerPoint. I hope that you're all having a wonderful week, and we're kind of over the hump as we get into week 10, over the hump of the mid-semester. So we're on that downhill slide. So I want to encourage you to hang in there, stay on top of your grade, stay on your schedule, and before you know it, the semester will be over. All right, so I'm going to look at the objectives that are on page 304 if you would like to join me in your text. The first objective for this chapter is to identify a modern day example for each of the 7 major themes of American educational history discussed in this chapter. 2, describe the major purpose of the common school during the 19th century and how it was financially supported. 3, identify the 2 major purposes of the comprehensive high school during the latter part of the 19th century and describe why this was unique to American education. Describe how private education provides an alternative to the public school. And lastly, number 5 is provide a brief overview of the historical struggles for equal educational opportunities for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, American Indians, Asian Americans, and women in the United States. So a lot of good historical perspectives to look at this week. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, and that brings up our PowerPoint. So again, this is chapter 10, and we're talking about the history of America's struggle for educational opportunity. Okay, here we go. So one of our objectives was to identify a modern day example for each of the 7 major themes of American educational history discussed in this chapter. Let's look at those themes. One is going to be local control. The second one is going to be universal education. Thirdly, we'll have public education. 4, comprehensive education. 5, secular education. 6, changing ideas of the basics. And 7 is going to be expanding definitions of educational access and equality. If you'd like to look at some more information about these in your text, you can find them on page 306. Oh, yes, 306. They actually start on 305 at the bottom, where it starts talking about local control. So local control, if you think about that sometimes attitude of too strong of a federal government, the framers of the U.S. Constitution really made no reference to education. And so what happened is in the Bill of Rights, that 10th Amendment basically says if we don't talk about it in the Constitution, then all of the power and the control goes to the state. And so from there, from the state, it can also go to the district. And then from the district, it can also go into, individual buildings and campuses within the district. And what we really see is that school boards and a lot of communities really like to have local control of education. On page 306, where it talks about universal education, you're really thinking about how you can ensure the quality of education regardless of where students live. Do they live in wealthy districts? Do they live in poorer districts? Do they live in urban and metropolitan districts? Or do they live in rural districts? So just really making sure that kids are getting a good, high quality education no matter where they live. The third one, public education. There's kind of always been that question, should private and religious schools receive public tax support? We are beginning to see some funds as far, like special education with we've got some scholarships in Arkansas, but they're really different funds from public education, because what we are really seeing is that we are not able to mix church and state in the aspect of really anything, but especially with schools. Fourthly, we have comprehensive education. Okay, so this goes into what are we requiring students to take? Are we requiring all of them to take some type of vocational training, or are we requiring all of them to have college prep training? Do we all follow the same curriculum? At what point do we stop following the same curriculum? These are all questions that are under consideration when we think about comprehensive education. So you've got your basic abilities, reading, writing, and math. That might have been, comprehensive in the past, but if you kind of jump forward to the sixth theme and you think about the changing ideas of the basics, well then, in this day and time, you've really got to think about engineering, and you've got to think about technology, and there are different things that might need to be included in comprehensive education, in this day and time. All right, the fifth one, I jumped around a little bit. The fifth one, secular education. When we're looking at the earliest colonial times, what was the purpose of education? Well, the purpose of education in colonial times, of course, was religious training. But somewhere in the 18th century and then really progressing till now, the function of education has become more secular. Now, we still want to promote moral values, and socially responsible students in American education, but it's not so much a religious attitude as social justice. And since I really already talked about the sixth one, the changing the ideas of the basics, I'm going to jump ahead to the seventh, where we're looking at expanding definitions of educational access and equality. Guys, this is something that, has just gone over time. If you think about including all races, all ethnic groups, all, including women, and then more recently, the idea of including all gender preferences, and making everyone feel welcome and have equal access and equality in our educational institutions. All right, so let's talk about that colonial education that I addressed in one of the ideas about the changing ideas of the basics. And if you think about that purpose of education in the past, in colonial times, it was very much that religious purpose. But let's kind of look at our nation in colonial times in different geographical areas. Of course, we had New England, we had the Middle Colonies, and then we also had the South. So for New England, we had the dame schools. And in dame schools, girls would learn basic household skills such as cooking and sewing, and then a little bit of reading, writing, some basic prayers, and religious beliefs. These dame schools often provided the only formal education that many of these children, especially the females, would receive. If you look at a different geographical area of the United States, you think about the Middle Colonies. There tended to be a more diverse population in the Middle Colonies. And also there were some private venture schools, and that was really the earliest form of a vocational education. I mean, when you think about town schools and district schools, New England really set the precedent that if parents could not or would not educate their children, then the government was really obligated to take on that job. Also, if you look at New England, you also need to think about a large population of Puritans. Now, Puritans thought that it was really important for everyone to be able to not only read the Bible, but also to interpret its teachings. And so they had something called the Old Deluder Satan Act. And so what that act really said was, we have got to teach these kids how to read so that they can read the Bible. That was prevalent in New England, and there was some flow of that into the Middle Colonies, and that thought as well of learning how to read could help you to read the Bible, and that would help you to live a good life. So that's New England and the Middle Colonies. Now let's look at the South. In the South, there wasn't as dense of a population. And so what happened is, with everyone being so spread out, there wasn't that aspect of that reality of really having the dame schools where we could kind of group together and learn. A lot of times in the South, it was, we're going to learn in our home. And so there wasn't near as much formal education for as many people in the South as there was in New England and in the Middle Colonies. The South did have more of a dispersed population, and as we know, in the South, in the colonial times, there was much more of a social class and racial distinction, and private tutoring was often just offered again in the home for the wealthy. So our arguments for and against common schools So 4, democracy depends on an educated populace. Also 4 is that common schools would promote a common American culture. And another 4 is enhance the opportunities for general prosperity. Against is going to be that some citizens pay for the schooling of other children. And the idea of the common school is that education is provided for the average person, and it is maybe not for all at this time. That's what we see. Of course, now we see education for all, but the idea of the common school is educating more and making it more available, not necessarily everyone, but making it more available, and maybe not at the public expense. This is where that idea came up for communities and towns paying for other people's children, or maybe that collective type school. And of course, that really, was the birthplace of what we have now, where everyone is taxed, and if you have children in school or not, your tax dollars can go or do go towards public education. Another argument against is that the weakened cultural identities of diverse groups, and we still see that push today, where when you're putting everyone together and you're learning the same things, that maybe you lose some of your cultural identity, and then some assimilation might happen. Also, some concerns over religious teachings in school, because who's paying for it? Well, then they might want their religious teachings taught, but if someone else is in that school and want a different aspect of religion being taught, or maybe it's that idea of, I don't really want someone else teaching my child about religion, I want to save it for our home and for church. So just really a lot of push and shove going on there. Okay, so the development of American elementary education. So a few of our influences are going to come from across the Atlantic Ocean. We've got some European influences. We have Froebel, we have Pestalozzi, Herbert, and Montessori. You've probably heard of the Montessori school. That's an Italian woman named Maria Montessori. Some curriculum changes, of course. It goes back to that idea of what is taught in a comprehensive education setting. Consolidation. What groups are being taught together. And we also have to think about that one-room school that served in the frontier days. In the 20th century, it really becomes clear that smaller, poor districts couldn't provide. You think about a few years ago, one of our governors in Arkansas with Mike Huckabee, that was a big piece of his time as governor in the state, was consolidating schools where it was not such a financial drain for some schools, because that's the Lakeview versus Huckabee case that really looked at, is funding fair across our state. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention one thing, which is extremely important, and I apologize on this slide. We can't forget about the idea of kindergarten. That is an idea from Friedrich Froebel. He's mentioned in that first bullet point about European influences. The kindergarten, or the children's garden is what that means, was one of his experiments, and it really reached very far. It reached reached American soil, and we see kindergarten across the United States today, where we're really looking at songs and stories used to lay a strong foundation for formal education. Okay, some progressive education principles. In our last chapter, we looked at John Dewey's idea of progressive education. And in this chapter, if you look on page 314, it talks about the Progressive Education Association. And we see these 7 pieces. The child should have freedom to develop naturally. Number 2 is going to be the natural interest is the best motive for work. And I think we could probably all agree with that. Number 3, the teacher is a guide and not a task maker. Measure student development scientifically, not just by grades. And so what all goes into measuring student progress? Fourthly, we have attention to health and physical development, and we've really thankfully seen a rebirth of the attention to health and physical development, and recess time and PE time, because what we know through a large research base is that physical exercise can actually help you cognitively. Next, we've got the school and the home must work together to meet the child's needs. And lastly, number 7 is that progressive schools as leaders in trying new educational ideas, and that the progressive schools really need to be the ones to promote those educational ideas. Okay, now then let's look at the development of secondary education. If you take some time to talk to some older people in your community, and I mean quite a bit older. You know, they might be able to convey to you that they didn't attend high school. Maybe their education ended at 8th grade, maybe ninth grade, because at that time maybe their parents viewed the education that they had attained by then that was comprehensive enough to do the things that they needed to do. Of course, we've really seen a big change with the value of a high school diploma in this day and time, and going even into the, maybe the difference between a GED and a high school diploma maybe being viewed differently for employment. Times have changed so much. And then, of course, there's that idea of vocational training, technical training, or a college degree. All right, let's look at the development of American secondary schools. On page 315, it talks about some of the early forms. One of them is going to be the Latin grammar schools, and this eventually became the college preparatory school. In all secondary education, just basically anything past the 6th grade, for a period of time, that sole purpose was preparing for entrance to college. You may see that differently now. All right, we have English grammar schools, and we also have academies. Our English grammar schools are going to meet the demand of that practical institution, from navigation and engineering to bookkeeping and foreign languages. So what was comprehensive for that time? What was seen as essential? And then we also think about secondary education for females, because of course that idea has changed. We see women now really being pioneers in science and technology and math, and that's we can really attribute that to a strong secondary education for females and advocacy for females as well. And next we've got to look at academy. So a new type of secondary school, this was known as the academy. It emerged during the second half of the 18th century, and that was an attempt to combine the Latin and the English grammar schools through separate Latin and English departments within one school. Academy, it says in the text that academies were unlike the Latin grammar schools, and that the primary language of the academy was English. So definitely something to consider there. All right, now we have public high schools. This is really what we see. And when you think about the public high school, you have to think about the famous the Kalamazoo case, which was in 1974. This was a court case that took place in Michigan, where the courts finally ruled that the school district could tax the public to support both high schools and elementary schools, because really the thinking before this time and leading up to this time was, well, maybe, secondary schools, if they're just preparation for college and kind of more some of the more classical training and not an essential training, does taxpayer money really need to support that? And then of course, with the Kalamazoo case, we saw that, yes, we are going to do that. Okay, the comprehensive high school. So when we think about comprehensive, it's going to be all of the different offerings for different people and different interests. So the comprehensive high school is going to offer sports, going to offer fine arts, going to offer the required settings, and those extracurricular things as well. Okay. Across Arkansas and the United States, we have a variety of different configurations of grades. And if you think about the school where you live, or maybe the school where you grew up, if you went to school, if maybe you weren't homeschooled, you think about the different grade configurations. Some schools have the idea of junior high, which is oftentimes, but not always, that 7th, 8th, and 9th, and then middle school, sometimes, but not always. We have 6th, 7th, and 8th. But like I said, just oftentimes it's left up to the district, and oftentimes the district will just look at, it's basically going to come down to logistics. What buildings do we have? What property do we have? What what are we financially able to maintain as far as buildings and property and maintenance, and then also teachers and principals and support staff and lunchrooms and libraries. What can we financially maintain? So some criticisms when we think about breaking it down to junior high, middle schools. Sometimes there's some critics will say that there's too much developmental focus and weak academics, that maybe it's not socially that it could be socially unhelpful to divide. And there are definitely some aspects to that call to return to a K-8 and then a 9-12. But of course, there are critics for that as well. All right, private education. This is going to provide an alternative for public schools. It could be for religious reasons. It could be maybe you just want a private education for your child and you're able to afford it, or others that are dissatisfied. Occasionally legislation will come up talking about, maybe if your child is living in an underperforming, a consistently underperforming school, then what can tax monies do to support getting your child to another school? Because just because you live in that, you think about high quality education for all, no matter where you live, which was one of those 7 themes that we looked at the very beginning of this PowerPoint. Well, here is a real world example. If I live in a district, I live in a place that the school is consistently underperforming, then what does that mean for my child? So, just some struggle, and that's when you get the issues of vouchers, or public funds paying for private education, and it really becomes a political struggle at that time. As far as private education, it's very interesting to point out that 28,000 plus schools enroll 5.1 million students across the United States. That's equates to 10% of U.S. students. And of that number, the Catholic schools are really the predominant venue for private education, and we see 2.3 million of those students. So really what this data means is that 10% of U.S. students attend private education, and almost half of those students attend Catholic schools across the United States. Kind of break that down for you. All right. More about the history for the history of the struggle for education. We cannot talk about this without looking at the education of minorities with African Americans before the Civil War. That motivation for religious reasons. Let's teach teach people how to read the Bible. And then in the late 19th century, the African American enrollment in the schools, which had been only 2% of the school-age children in 1850, did reach 35% by 1890. And then we look at Booker T. Washington and also the Morrill Act and the 1890 Institution. So let's talk about that. The 1890 institutions were created for the higher education of African Americans. Okay. Some of these historically African American colleges you may be familiar with, like Florida A&M and North Carolina A&T, still exist today, but they are now, of course, integrated institutions. Booker T. Washington, he was an African American teacher. He lived from 1856 to 1915. He started an African American normal school here's the thing, in Alabama in 1891. And if you think about what was going on in American history in 1881, so you're looking at less than 20 years after the Civil War in Alabama. So that really, when you really put that into context, it was just a really, really big deal. The Morrill Act. This was something that happened in 1862, where the U.S. Congress, this was legislation that was granted to each state with a minimum of 30,000 acres of federal land, that with the understanding that the income from the rent or sale of these lands must be used to establish colleges for the study of agricultural and mechanical arts. Again, you might have heard of some of these institutions, these resulting land-grant institutions: University of Illinois, Texas A&M, Michigan State University. And of course, these institutions have enrolled thousands, some probably millions over the years. All right, 20th century, we have a focus on offering a broader variety of curriculum options. And of course, hopefully that will continue to grow. All right, so let's look at the history of school desegregation efforts. In 1954, you see the overturning of the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling that had happened in 1896 as a result from some segregation that was happening on railroads, where it said separate but equal is okay. So in 1954, this Brown versus the Board of Education ruling overturned that and said that separate but equal is not okay, because what we know is that those facilities were not equal. And of course, just because the law passes doesn't mean that everyone buys in and does what they are supposed to do. In the 60s and in the 1960s and the 80s, there's this controversy over busing, and there's that white flight. And you think about desegregation. Some communities or some schools are segregated because that's just the way that that's how the population is in that community. But what we really saw with that idea of the white flight in the 60s and the 80s was the population of the school, the demographics of the school did not match the community, because people were leaving and taking their children to other places. In 1971, you've got Swan versus the Charlotte-Mecklenburg ruling that backed the busing to hasten desegregation. In the 90s to the present, we have the reversal or end of many desegregation programs, because thankfully we are seeing some, and I don't want to be political, but in some areas we are seeing racial tensions waning. But of course, we also know that in some areas we are seeing racial tensions escalate. All right, education of minorities with American Indians on reservations. Of course, they're receiving schooling from missionaries in the 1890s to the 1970s. There are some missionary schools that are gradually replaced by government boarding schools, specifically the Bureau of Indian Affairs. By 1965, American Indians began to demand control of their school, and they did not want to be assimilated into American culture. Between 1972 and 1975, Congress enacted 3 bills that encouraged the establishment of community-run schools, offered grants to develop culturally relevant and bilingual curriculum materials, and established an advisory council of American Indians. So what we see there is that they're actually having a say in what goes on with their education. And lastly, today, the education of the American Indian population, which is about 530,000 students, is plagued by problems such as poverty, parental alcoholism, underachievement, absenteeism, overage students, and a very high dropout rate. All right, next let's look at the education of minorities and consider Hispanics. Of course, you probably are aware of this, that the Hispanic population is the fastest growing population in the United States. Hispanic children first attended religious mission schools. The common school of the 19th and 20th centuries often sealed off opportunities for Hispanics. Today, 25% of Hispanic students do speak mostly Spanish at home, but 49% of those have parents with a high school education or higher. In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act did provide new support for the education of Hispanics. And then with the reauthorization of that Elementary and Secondary Education Act with No Child Left Behind, and then again the reauthorization with the Every Student Succeeds Act with ESSA, we are seeing more accountability and more support for the education of Hispanics in our bilingual population. Another response has been the establishment of bilingual education programs to provide students with instruction in their native tongue at the same time that they learn English. And lastly, Hispanic youth do represent that fastest growing segment of the U.S. population. Okay. Our last slide, we're going to look at the education of Asian Americans. So this is really within this group, there is diversity, of course, with all groups, but especially with this group, because you're looking at the three largest groups of Asian Americans are individuals of Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese heritage. So very, very different areas of the United States as far as, or not, excuse me, different areas of the world from where their heritage is coming. School segregation of Chinese American children in California lasted until at least 1946, so you have to look at the influence there of World War II. The Japanese American children in California were forced to attend segregated schools up until World War II. With the end of World War II, some of that discrimination against Asian Americans did begin to subside. This group has often been touted as the model minority. This stereotype can be misleading and has sometimes contributed to misconceptions and complacency in meeting the educational needs and concerns of Asian American students. And the last bulleted point on this slide, as we're looking at Asian American students, is parental and community involvement of Asian Americans in the education process really does need to be fostered. Okay, so that is it for Chapter 10. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at jonesk@uaccm.edu. I hope that you all have a wonderful week, and I will be seeing you soon.